All right, so get ready to dive into 16th century Catholicism.
Mm, sounds intense.
It is. We're tackling the Catechism of the Council of Trent. And let me tell you, this document is a beast, but a fascinating beast.
It really is, and you've given us so much material to work with.
It's dense, but it's a historical and theological goldmine.
Absolutely. And what makes it even more fascinating, I think, is the context, right? It comes out of this incredibly tumultuous time for the church. We're talking Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin. These figures are shaking the very foundations of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, for centuries, the church was the authority, and suddenly its doctrines are being challenged left and right.
And not just challenged, I mean openly attacked and debated.
So how does the church respond to this earthquake? Enter the Council of Trent, right?
Exactly. From 1545 to 1563, this massive council meets to basically try and deal with this earthquake, with all these challenges that the Protestant Reformation is throwing at them.
So tons of scholars, theologians, bishops all gathered together.
Oh, yeah, and they produce a ton of really dense scholarly documents.
So where does the Catechism fit in? Was that like their attempt at I don't know.
A highlight reel.
Yeah, kind of.
In a way, yeah, you could think of it like that. It's meant to be a more accessible, digestible guide. At least initially, it was intended for priests.
Okay.
To give them sort of the key doctrines, the key arguments in a more practical format.
So it's like taking this huge, complicated event and making like a user-friendly manual, right? Particularly for those on
The front lines.
the front lines, exactly.
Having to explain and defend the church's position.
And amidst all this chaos, you've got everyday Catholics looking for answers, looking for guidance.
Absolutely, and that's a crucial point. It wasn't just about clarifying doctrine for the clergy, right? It was about unifying everyday Catholics. Remember, this is a time when the very idea of religious authority is being questioned.
Yeah, like who do we listen to?
Exactly. The Catechism aimed to re-educate, to solidify the Catholic worldview for everyone, from the priests to the people in the pews.
Makes sense. Now, one of the biggest bones of contention with the Protestants was the role of Scripture, right? They were all about sola scriptura, Scripture alone, as the ultimate source of religious authority.
Right, and it's important to understand what that means. It's the belief that the Bible is the only infallible source of Christian teachings, and anything beyond that is sort of up for debate.
So how did the Catechism address that? Because they didn't just throw the Bible out, right?
No, not at all. In fact, the Catechism references Scripture constantly. What it argues is that relying solely on the Bible ignores centuries of church teachings, centuries of interpretations that have helped to illuminate its meaning. It's about recognizing the continuity of faith passed down through generations, not just individual interpretations.
It's like they're saying, hold on, there's a bigger picture here.
Exactly. It's not just about the words on the page, but the living tradition that gives those words context and meaning.
So we've got this fascinating clash, right? You've got this new way of thinking about faith, challenging the established order, and the church is trying to like hold its ground while also making its teachings clear in this new landscape.
And that's where the Catechism comes in. It's like their attempt to say, okay, here's how we understand things and here's why.
So how did they structure this counter-reformation, so to speak, in a user-friendly way?
Well, they did it by creating a very clear four-part structure that addressed what they saw as the most critical points of contention with the Protestants.
And that's where things get really interesting. Okay, so walk me through this structure a bit. What are these four parts?
Well, they start with the Apostles' Creed.
Okay, familiar territory.
Right. It's like the bedrock of Christian belief, something both Catholics and Protestants could generally agree on.
So common ground to start.
Exactly. But then it moves on to the sacraments, and that's where things start to get interesting.
Because that was a major point of divergence, right?
Huge. And the Catechism really lays out the importance of all seven sacraments, emphasizing how these are channels of God's grace.
Directly countering the Protestant reformers, some of whom were like, do we really need all these?
Exactly. They were questioning the validity, the necessity of things like confirmation or confession. And the Catechism is pushing back, saying, no, these are essential, and here's why.
Here's what they really mean. Okay, so that's the sacraments. What about the other two parts?
Well, the third part tackles the Ten Commandments.
Classic.
Right. But again, it's not just listing them out. It's about providing a moral framework rooted in Scripture and tradition.
So how to actually live out your faith.
Precisely. These aren't just arbitrary rules. They're a path to spiritual growth, a way to live in right relationship with God and others. And the fourth part that focuses on the Lord's Prayer.
Interesting. So it's like bookending the Catechism with prayer.
In a way, yeah. And again, it's not just reciting the words, it's unpacking what they mean, how this one simple prayer encapsulates the essence of Christian prayer, this idea of connecting with God on a personal level.
So we've got the basics of faith, sacraments, morality, prayer, a pretty comprehensive guide.
And what's really cool is how they back it all up. It's not just stating doctrines.
Right. You were saying earlier they were very thorough.
Oh, yeah. They wanted to create an ironclad case drawing on scripture, tradition, historical authority, you name it.
So it's like they're not just saying because we said so.
No, they're saying, look, we've got centuries of church fathers, Saints Ambrose, Augustine, you've got papal decrees, pronouncements from previous councils, all supporting these teachings.
Like they're building a case brick by brick.
Exactly. And remember, one of the big criticisms from the reformers was that the church had strayed from its roots. And the Catechism's like, hold on, that's not true at all. These doctrines are rooted in centuries of tradition and interpretation.
So how did the everyday person wrap their head around all this? Because it still sounds pretty dense.
Well, that's the brilliance of it. It manages to be both theologically rigorous and surprisingly accessible.
Give me an example. How do you explain something like the Eucharist in a way that makes sense to someone who's not a theologian, especially given all the controversy surrounding it during the Reformation?
Right. We'll take transubstantiation, for example.
Okay, the idea that the bread and wine actually become the body and blood of Christ.
Which, let's be honest, is a pretty difficult concept to wrap your head around.
A lot of Protestants were like, nope, not buying it.
Exactly. But the Catechism doesn't shy away from it. It uses vivid language, relatable analogies to try to explain this really complex doctrine.
Like what?
Well, for example, it compares receiving the Eucharist to physical nourishment, saying that just as food strengthens the body, the Eucharist nourishes the soul.
I see. So trying to connect it to something people could relate to.
Exactly. It's about engaging people on a practical, experiential level while staying true to the doctrine.
So they really put a lot of thought into making this something that could resonate with people from all walks of life.
They did, and the impact of that is incredible. It wasn't just about clarifying doctrine in the 16th century. This thing had serious staying power.
So this catechism, it's a landmark document, we've got that, but it was written, what, like almost 500 years ago?
It was. It's amazing.
And people are still studying it, admiring it. Not a lot of books you can say that about.
You're right. It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
It really is. So how did a text born out of this very specific conflict, a Reformation in the 1500s, how did it manage to stay relevant for so long?
Well, I think it's because underneath all those specific theological debates, it's tapping into something much more universal. Those big questions about faith, about grace, about how to live a moral life. It gives you a framework for understanding God, yourself, your place in the world.
So it's more than just a historical document. It's giving you a way to live.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's still relevant today. Those core truths, they transcend the specific historical circumstances.
It's a framework for understanding, and we're still grappling with these questions.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating is how it's reached beyond just the Catholic Church.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you have scholars from all different Christian denominations studying it.
Why is that?
Well, for one, it's a goldmine of historical insight, but also it's just a really profound work of theology. People recognize its contribution to the broader Christian tradition.
So it's not just a single denomination's interpretation. It sparked a wider conversation.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that's still ongoing. And I think that speaks volumes about its impact.
It really does. I mean, we're still talking about it.
And, one of the things I find so compelling about it is it doesn't shy away from these complex theological issues. It wrestles with them head on.
Yeah, it doesn't sugarcoat anything.
No, it doesn't. But it manages to do it in a way that's both intellectually rigorous, like we were saying, but also surprisingly accessible.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and they really pull it off.
Well, I think this has been a fascinating deep dive, to say the least.
I agree.
The Catechism of the Council of Trent, it's a window into a pivotal moment in church history.
Absolutely.
But it also offers, as we've been saying, this timeless wisdom, these insights into faith and reason that are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
And it reminds us that even in the midst of disagreement, even in those moments of intense division, there's always room for dialogue, for understanding, for searching for those common truths that can bring us together.
I think that's a great note to end on. So thank you so much for taking this deep dive with me. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
It really has. Thanks for having me.